World of Warcraft has always had racials, which are small abilities tied to a character's race. Most of the time, they're minor conveniences, but occasionally they've had an outsized impact on progression rating. In some cases, guilds literally race-changed entire rosters, or Blizzard was forced to nerf the ability after it trivialized key mechanics. And at number 10, we have Arcane Torrent version Purge. When Battle for Azeroth first launched, Uldir became the first raid of the expansion and quickly set the tone for how brutal progression rating would be. Xul Reborn stood out as one of the more punishing encounters, largely due to his overwhelming add mechanics. Arcane Torrent was reworked in Legion into a group purge, removing a beneficial effect from all nearby enemies. Unlike a normal purge, which was single target, Arcane Torrent could instantly remove multiple dangerous buffs and do it across an entire pack of adds, something only Disc Priest could do with a Mass Dispel. Horde guilds stacked Blood Elves specifically to deal with these mechanics, and in progression scenarios where every second counted, this racial erased a significant amount of complexity from the fight. No Alliance racial offered a comparable form of Mass Dispel. Blood Elves were providing utility that no one else could match, giving Horde guilds a structural advantage when building rosters for Xul. The impact was so clear that during early progression, log shored Horde guilds killing Xul weeks ahead of their Alliance counterparts. Alliance guilds simply lacked an equivalent tool and had to brute force mechanics with more healing and coordination. The racial essentially warped progression balance, not because of DPS increases, but because it allowed raid leaders to design strategies around having free extra dispels every couple of minutes. In competitive raiding, where world first kills are decided by razor-thin margins, that level of utility was invaluable. This wasn't the first time Arcane Torrent had been strong though. Back in Burning Crusade, it provided an AoE silence which trivialized several fights as well. But Xul was the prime example of its modern Purge design breaking an encounter. Ultimately, the racial became infamous for how much easier it made the fight compared to other options, and it reinforced the perception that Blood Elves were not just the most popular race, but also mechanically one of the most overpowered in raid content. And at number 9, we have Troll Beast Slaying in Throne of Thunder. Throne of Thunder was the second raid of Mist of Pandaria, and is remembered as one of the most ambitious and mechanically complex raids Blizzard has ever released at the time. With 13 bosses, it was massive in scale. But what stood out most for Troll players was just how many of these bosses were technically classified as beasts. Out of the full roster, 4 encounters, Horadon, Tortos, Magera, and Jikun, all counted as beast-type enemies. That's nearly 1/3 of the raid being flagged in a way that directly interacted with the troll racial Beast Slaying, which at the time granted a flat 5% damage increase against beasts. Normally, this racial was more of a flavor perk. Most raids in WoW's history didn't feature many beast-type bosses, meaning the bonus rarely came into play outside of leveling content or the occasional dungeon. But Throne of Thunder flipped that expectation. Suddenly, a racial that was typically ignored became one of the strongest DPS enhancing racials in the game, and not just for one fight, but for nearly half of the tier's progression. For Horde guilds stacked with troll players, this was essentially a free raid-wide buff in multiple encounters, giving them a distinct edge. To put this into perspective, most damage-focusing racials at the time provided small throughput bumps. Orcs had Blood Fury, which was a short burst of attack power, and trolls themselves also just had Berserking, a haste cooldown that was already considered one of the best DPS racials available. The synergy of having both Berserking and Beast Slaying stacked together meant that trolls could output significantly higher numbers than any other racial option. That flat 5% damage increase wasn't situational like a proc or a cooldown. It was just always active throughout the fight. Over a 10-minute boss battle, this translated into millions of extra damage, the kind of gap no profession bonus or gear optimization could realistically close. The advantage was so pronounced that many Horde raiders who weren't already trolls quickly race changed to take advantage of it. Guilds competing for early kills couldn't afford to pass up what was effectively free extra DPS on some of the hardest encounters of the tier. Horadon, for instance, was infamous as an early wall that required not only perfect ad control, but also very high raid DPS to prevent being overwhelmed. Trolls simply made the fight easier in a way that no other race could match. Blizzard clearly took notice, as in the very next expansion, Warlords of Draenor, Beast Slaying was reworked entirely. Instead of a direct 5% damage increase to beasts, it was changed to grant 20% increased experience from killing beasts instead while leveling. This was a clear sign that developers recognized how dangerous a flat racial damage modifier could be in raid content. Throne of Thunder had proven that when too many bosses aligned with a racial's design, the balance of an entire tier could be warped in the favor of one race. In hindsight, this tier was the perfect storm for beast slaying. The racial was usually irrelevant, but when it mattered far too much. Trolls already had some of the strongest racial tools in the game, and Throne of Thunder showed just how broken things became when Blizzard's encounter design unintentionally amplified their advantages. And at number 8, we have Seal of Blood from the Burning Crusade. TBC introduced many new class mechanics, but perhaps none stood out more controversially than the Horde-exclusive Paladin ability Seal of Blood. This ability was granted only to Blood Elf Paladins, while Alliance Paladins received Seal of Vengeance instead. On paper, Seal of Blood looked risky. It converted a portion of the Paladin's damage into self-inflicted recoil damage, but in practice, this recoil was trivial compared to the enormous DPS increase it provided, and during early raid progression, it meant Horde Retribution Paladins vastly outperformed their Alliance counterparts. One of the best early examples of this imbalance came in Gruul's Lair. Gruul the Dragon Killer was an early tier raid boss that functioned as both a DPS and gear check. The encounter was designed to punish raids that couldn't meet strict damage thresholds. Since Gruul's mechanics, like his ever-increasing damage buff growth and raid-wide shatter mechanics, pushed players harder the longer the fight went on. Every class had to perform efficiently, and raids couldn't afford to carry underperformers. Here, Seal of Blood pushed Horde Retribution Paladins into a tier viability that Alliance Ret Pallies simply could not reach. Comparisons between the two seals were striking. Seal of Vengeance required ramp-up time to build Holy Vengeance stacks, and it wasn't as effective in shorter fights or against multiple targets. Seal of Blood, by contrast, provided immediate, consistent burst damage. Horde Paladins didn't just keep up, they excelled. For a spec that was often maligned as underwhelming in Classic WoW, Seal of Blood effectively changed that conversation. On Horde side, Ret Paladins became legitimate raid contenders. On Alliance side, they were still considered second tier. This difference had ripple effects. Top Horde guilds leaned into their Paladins for extra DPS and progression, while Alliance raiders had to work harder to compensate. The advantage didn't go unnoticed by Blizzard either. By the time Wrath of the Lich King launched, Alliance Paladins were given Seal of the Martyr, effectively mirroring the mechanics of Seal of Blood, so that both factions had access to the same tools. This was a rare instance of Blizzard explicitly admitting that a faction-exclusive ability had created too much imbalance in competitive content. Even that wasn't the end of the story. Seal of Blood and Seal of the Martyr remained controversial in Wrath due to their sheer damage potential, and by the time Cataclysm arrived, Blizzard removed both entirely, consolidating the Paladin Seal mechanic to eliminate the problem at its root. The reasoning was simple: an ability so strong that it required faction homogenization, followed by eventual removal, had no place in balanced design. Seal of Blood's legacy is therefore a case study on how one racial exclusive design choice, Blood Elves being the only source of the ability, had raid-wide implications. In early Burning Crusade raids, Horde rosters gained a structural DPS advantage simply by having access to a tool that Alliance players did not. For players pushing Gruul and other DPS checks, the difference was night and day. And at number 7, we have Will of the Forsaken. Among the earliest racial abilities in WoW, none had more impact on raiding mechanics than the Forsaken's Will of the Forsaken. This racial provided an instant way to break free from fear, charm, or sleep effects on a 2-minute cooldown. In a game where crowd control effects could decide the outcome of an encounter, this was invaluable. For much of Classic WoW and even into later expansions, encounters were designed around punishing fears or mind control mechanics. The ability to ignore these mechanics outright made undead players uniquely valuable to raid groups. One of the most notorious examples was Onyxia. Her fear could disrupt tank positioning, cause her to unleash her devastating breath attack across the raid. While Alliance players had Fear Ward to protect their tanks, Horde had no real equivalent, except for the undead tanks which could use Will of the Forsaken to instantly break free from the fear. In a fight where a mistimed tank fear could result in a wipe, this was a defining advantage. Moving forward, the racial's value only grew as Blizzard leaned into mind control mechanics. Encounters like Nathria and Cataclysm used mind control effects that normally required coordination and interrupts to handle. An undead player, however, could simply ignore the mechanic by pressing their racial, trivializing one of the fight's signature challenges. Even in fights without direct mind control, raid bosses liberally used fears, making Will of the Forsaken a consistent tool for uptime and positioning. Compared to other racials of the era, the difference was stark. Night Elves had Shadow Meld, which was useful defensively for a dropping threat, but rarely game-changing in raids. Torrents had War Stomp, an AoE stun which could interrupt and control adds, but it was often redundant in a raid setting, where stuns were not only plentiful, but often didn't work on tanks or their ads. Draenei had Gift of the Naru, a small healing cooldown which was marginal in the face of raid-wide damage mechanics. Will of the Forsaken, on the other hand, directly countered effects that entire encounters were balanced around. Instead of reacting to mechanics with teamwork, undead players could simply opt out of them. The competitive advantages gave Horde players did not go unnoticed. In PvP, it was already infamous for breaking Warlock fears and Priest mind control, but in PvE, the imbalance was more subtler and more insidious. If your guild stacked undead players, you had more tools to bypass mechanics than Alliance guilds would have. Blizzard eventually addressed this by removing the ability to break boss-specific mind control effects. Later iterations of the racial extended the cooldown and turned it to more closely resemble the nerfed human racial every man for himself, which only broke stuns. This reduced its dominance, but its legacy as one of the most powerful racial mechanics in raiding history was already cemented. Will the Forsaken remains one of the clearest examples of how a racial ability, designed primarily for flavor or PvP, could spiral into a raid-breaking advantage. By letting players bypass fears, charms, and sleeps that entire encounters were built around, it fundamentally altered progression paths and forced Blizzard to reconsider racial balance in a raiding context. And at number 6, we have Stoneform for the Stone Legion Generals. When Shadowlands launched, Castle Nathria quickly developed a reputation as one of the more punishing raid tiers in modern WoW. Amongst its most notorious encounters was Stone Legion Generals, a fight that combined high damage, constant movement, and raid-wide bleeds that take down players relentlessly. What made this fight infamous was not only the intensity of the mechanics, but also how one racial ability, the Dwarf racial Stoneform, effectively allowed an entire guild to bypass part of the encounter. Stoneform historically has been seen as a defensive racial, cleansing bleeds, poisons, and diseases while also reducing damage taken. For most of WoW's history, this was situationally useful, but rarely game-breaking. Shadowlands changed that. In the Stone Legion's general encounter, several mechanics applied powerful bleed effects that stacked dangerously, straining healers and often forcing external cooldowns to stabilize the raid. For most players, managing these bleeds was one of the key progressing hurdles of the fight. But for dwarves, Stoneform erased the problem completely. A well-timed racial press would simply delete the bleeds, saving healer cooldowns and trivializing what was intended to be one of the fight's most punishing mechanics. The impact of progression was immediate. Guilds chasing Mythic World first discovered that mass race changing to dwarves was an extremely cost-effective way to make the fight significantly easier. One high-profile guild did change their entire roster, transforming their raid into a lineup of dwarves just to cheese the bleeds. This was not a matter of minor optimization. It was the difference between repeatedly wiping to a damage over the time mechanic and effectively ignoring it altogether. Blizzard themselves acknowledged how broken this was when, shortly after the discovery, they hotfixed Stoneform to no longer remove the problematic bleeds from the encounter. This kind of mid-tier nerf targeting a racial ability is extraordinarily rare, underscoring just how disruptive Stoneform had become. The Stone Legion Generals incident became a case study in how racial design can unintentionally warp raid progression. While most racials were balanced around small conveniences, their thematic flavor, Stoneform turned into a mandatory button for world-first competitors. The fallout forced Blizzard to hard-code exceptions into the ability, stripping away its interaction with Castle Nathria bleeds. The very fact that they had to disable racials mid-tier shows how far beyond its intended purpose Stoneform had gone. Ultimately, Stoneforge on Stone Legion Generals highlighted the fragility of encounter design when racials are left unchecked. In a raid tier remembered for brutal tuning, this racial gave one race an outsized advantage, to the point that top guilds felt compelled to abandon their chosen identities and reroll en masse. Few examples in WoW's raiding history show as clearly how a single racial ability could force both the community and developers to respond in real time. And at number 5, we have Heroic Presence. In the Burning Crusade, Blizzard introduced the Draenei as a new allied race. The racials were unassuming at first, with the Gift of the Naru offering a small heal and gem cutting providing a jewel crafting bonus. But hidden amongst them was Heroic Presence, a passive aura that granted plus 1% hit chance to all party members. At a time when reaching hit cap was one of the most important and restrictive gearing goals in raiding, this single aura had far-reaching consequences that shaped raid composition throughout the Burning Crusade and Wrath of the Lich King. To understand why Heroic Presence was broken, it's important to look at how hit chance worked in early WoW. Melee characters needed around 8% hit to avoid missing special attacks, while spellcasters required 17% hit for the same reliability. Missing an ability wasn't just wasted DPS. For classes like Hunters or Warlocks, it could mean lost debuffs, broken rotations, or an entire spell school becoming unreliable. Every percentage point of hit rating was invaluable, especially in the earlier tiers where gear budgets were tight. Heroic Presence gave players a flat 1% hit, essentially erasing the need for an entire gear slot's worth of stats. Early on in TBC, the aura even stacked. 2 Draenei in the same party could get 1% hit, one from their own aura and then another 1% from another Draenei, which represented 25% of the total melee cap. This quickly became a priority for melee-heavy groups. Blizzard patched the stacking issue out, but even at a flat 1% per party, the ratio remained too good to ignore. Melee players would often demand to be grouped with a Draenei, and raid leaders built their compositions with at least 1 Draenei per melee group to maximize efficiency. Horde, lacking access to Draenei, had no such equivalent. Their only comparable offensive racials were situational cooldowns, not permanent stat boosts. The power gap became clear when comparing Heroic Presence to other racials of the era. Humans had the Human Spirit, a spirit increase that barely impacted raid DPS. Gnomes had Expansive Mind, a modest intellect increase that paled next to a status critical as hit. Heroic Presence wasn't situational, nor was it a minor convenience. It fundamentally solved one of the hardest gearing requirements for an entire group. By Wrath of the Lich King, Heroic Presence was expanded to affect the whole raid, not just the Draenei's party. This further cemented its role as a raid utility racial, to the point that Alliance guilds had a permanent advantage in progression. A Draenei in your raid meant everyone could shift gear choices, prioritize other stats, and reach performance benchmarks faster. Horde players had nothing that matched this consistency. The imbalance became so entrenched that Blizzard eventually removed Heroic Presence from affecting anyone but the player themselves in Cataclysm, citing the difficulty of balancing encounters around one faction, effectively just having more hit rating. Heroic Presence illustrates one of the rare times where a racial provided persistent passive throughput rather than a situational active button. That persistence made it indispensable, shaping raid comps, raid balance, and ultimately faction choice at the highest levels of play. While not as flashy as a Silence or a Fear Break, it quietly tilted the scales of progression for years until Blizzard finally deemed it too strong to remain in the game. And at number 4, we have Rocket Jump with Kil'Jaeden in Mythic Tomb of Sargeres. When players think about raid-breaking racials, the Goblin racial Rocket Jump often comes to mind. Usually it's a quality of life tool, a short leap forward on a 1.5 minute cooldown that helps with positioning, similar to a watered-down version of a blink. But during Mythic Kil'Jaeden and Tomb of Sargeres, Rocket Jump became more than just a convenience. It became a progression-saving racial that provided certain classes with a survivable tool that others lacked, giving Goblin players a distinct advantage that pushed many guilds to recommend race swapping. Mythic Kil'Jaeden was notorious for its Fog of War intermission phases. The boss would plunge the platform into darkness, forcing players to find Illidan's guidance while simultaneously dealing with adds, beams, and knockback mechanics. The most infamous of these was Rupturing Singularity, and the subsequent knockbacks that could hurl players off the platform entirely. Some classes had built-in counterplay. Mages could blink back, demon hunters could glide, warlocks could drop gateways, and hunters had disengage. But for specs without these tools, priest, death knights, and some other melee classes, surviving a badly timed knockback was nearly impossible without outside assistance. This is where Rocket Jump came in. Goblins, regardless of class, suddenly had an insurance button. If Kil'Jaeden punted them into the abyss, Rocket Jump could correct their positioning and bring them safely back onto the platform. It wasn't just mobility, it was progression insurance on one of the hardest raid bosses in the modern game. In fact, it was one of the hardest boss fights in the game's history, period. The ability's universal utility cut across role lines, giving healers and DPS who normally had no way to self-save an option that could literally prevent a wipe. The influence of Rocket Jump and Kil'Jaeden's progression was visible at the highest levels of rating. World First contenders min-maxed every advantage, and players on classes without knockback immunities or recoveries seriously considered race-changing to Goblin for this fight. Even guilds not competing for World First kills acknowledged the strength. For many rosters, having a few Goblins in the lineup meant a form of raid insurance. Unlike some other racials on this list, Rocket Jump wasn't nerfed mid-raid tier, but its performance on Kil'Jaeden cemented its reputation as one of the strongest utility racials in WoW's history. Blizzard later introduced encounter designs that accounted for extra mobility, ensuring Rocket Jump wouldn't single-handedly invalidate mechanics again. Still, Tomb of Sargeres showed how one small racial button could reshape progression, especially when paired with punishing bosses like Kil'Jaeden where every wipe was costly. Rocket Jump may look like a gimmick on paper, but during Mythic Kil'Jaeden, it was the difference between another frustrating wipe in the dark and surviving long enough to push for boss. For many guilds, that alone made Goblin the race of choice during Legion's toughest challenge. And at number 3, we have Fear Ward. In classic WoW, few abilities were as infamous or as essential as Fear Ward. Originally exclusive to Dwarf Priests, Fear Ward provided a single target buff that made a player immune to the next fear effect cast on them. It lasted a few minutes and was consumed once triggered. On paper, it looked like a situational defensive racial spell. In practice, it became one of the most important tools in early raiding, particularly during the Onyxia layer encounter, where it turned a potential raid wiping mechanic into a trivial one. Onyxia's defining danger was her bellowing roar, a fear she cast periodically throughout the fight. If the main tank was feared at the wrong time, she could turn, breathe fire across the raid, and wipe dozens of players instantly. Positioning classic raids was already fragile, with players stacked in tight clumps to manage whelps and fireballs. A single, uncontrolled fear on the tank almost always meant a full raid reset. The solution was Fear Ward. By placing the buff on the tank, Dwarven Priests essentially deleted this mechanic, allowing the raid to avoid catastrophic wipes that Horde guilds simply had to gamble through with luck or alternative weaker tools. The strength of Fear Ward becomes clear when compared to other racial or class counters at the same time. Shamans could use Tremor Totem, but its pulse tick rate was inconsistent, meaning the tank could still be feared before the totem ticked. Undead players had Will the Forsaken, but that only applied to themselves, not the raid's critical tank. In contrast, Fear Ward was reliable, targeted, and reusable every few minutes, which made it vastly superior to anything Horde could field. This imbalance created one of the earliest factional divides in raiding. Alliance guilds with access to Dwarven Priests had a built-in progression advantage, trivializing encounters like Onyxia and even later bosses with fear mechanics such as Magmadar and Molten Core or Nefarian and Blackwing Lair. Horde guilds, by contrast, had to just work harder, rely on consumables, or risk RNG wipes due to fear timings. For tanks, especially being Dwarven and having a Fear Ward priest in your group, was often the difference between smooth progression and nights of frustration. Fear Ward's dominance eventually forced Blizzard's hand. In later patches and expansions, it was made available to all priests, not just dwarves, before being reworked entirely in the Burning Crusade. The spell's journey from racial exclusive utility to universal priest ability reflected just how critical it had been in shaping early raid design and faction balance. Blizzard had to normalize it because, for years, Alliance raiding had an undeniable edge, until eventually they just removed it from the game altogether. In Onyxia's lair, Fear Ward wasn't just useful, it was indispensable. It exemplifies how one small, racial-linked spell could dramatically shift raid outcomes and fuel faction debates that still echo today. And at number 2, we have the Voodoo Shuffle and Mythic Jaina. Troll racials have often been celebrated for berserking, the powerful haste cooldown, but it was their less flashy racial, the Voodoo Shuffle, that quietly broke one of the most punishing fights in recent WoW history, Mythic Lady Jaina Proudmoore in the battle for Dazar'alor. The racial reduced the duration of all movement and parry effects by 20%. On paper, it was designed for PvP, helping players escape slows in battlegrounds or arenas, but in the Jaina encounter, it became the single most important racial in the World First race, allowing troll players to sidestep a mechanic that was otherwise designed to be inescapable. The key mechanic was Chilling Touch. Throughout the fight, players accumulated stacks of this debuff, which reduced movement speed and, upon reaching 20 stacks, froze the player solid. Normally, you had to manage stacks carefully by standing in fire barrels during earlier phases to clear them, but in the final phase, there were no barrels left. Players were intended to eventually freeze, overwhelming the raid with adds and ending the fight if Jaina wasn't defeated in time. It was a soft and rage mechanic. Troll players, however, discovered that the Voodoo Shuffle altered the math. Because the racial reduced slows, the stacking debuff ticked differently on troll characters. With perfect play, trolls could extend their uptime before freezing, or in some cases prevent the freeze entirely at crucial points. This allowed guilds stacked with trolls to keep damage dealers and healers active much longer in the fight than intended, drastically lowering the encounter's difficulty. The impact was immediate and visible. During the World First race, top guilds like Method and Limit had raiders race change en masse to troll in order to exploit the Voodoo Shuffle. The final phase of Jaina, which was supposed to feel claustrophobic and punishing, became far more forgiving with a troll-heavy roster. Blizzard later acknowledged the imbalance by tightening how the racial interact with raid mechanics, ensuring that future slow or freeze effects would just ignore the Voodoo Shuffle. This encounter is one of the clearest examples in WoW's history of a racial turning a hard and rage mechanic into something trivial. Trolls weren't just strong, they were mandatory. When World First guilds were willing to spend thousands of gold and even real money to swap their entire roster's race just for one fight, it's the clearest signal that a racial has broken the design intent of the raid. And at number 1, we have Arcane Torrent Silence. When Blood Elves were introduced in the Burning Crusade, their racial ability Arcane Torrent looked modest on paper. A short-range AoE silence on a 2-minute cooldown. In PvP, it was disruptive, but in raids, it quickly became infamous, as it gave Horde guilds a unique interrupt tool that simply didn't exist anywhere else in the game. Its first major proving ground was Magtheridon's Lair, one of the earliest 25-player raid encounters of the expansion. Magtheridon's fight began with 5 Hellfire Channelers, each spamming Shadow Bolt volleys that had to be interrupted. If too many casts went through, the raid would collapse under overwhelming raid-wide damage. Even with a full suite of interrupts from classes like Rogues, Shamans, and Warriors, the demand was punishing. A single mistake in the opening minute could doom the entire pool. Blood Elves just added an extra layer of insurance. Even outside the TBC, Arcane Torrent kept breaking fights. In Wrath of the Lich King, it was invaluable in Lady Deathwhisper to silence her caster ads, which could spiral out of control without quick interrupts. In Trial the Crusader, it was another strong tool for lockdown and faction champions, essentially functioning like a free extra interrupt in a fight modeled on PvP chaos. By the time Cataclysm arrived, Arcane Torrent's reputation was well established. On Cho'Gall, tentacles spawned during corruption phases that spammed eye beams, which needed to be interrupted or stunned immediately. In Spoils of Pandaria and Mop, Arcane Torrent was especially good as you'd frequently be fighting packs of 3 to 5 casters at once. Its influence extended even into later expansions. In Warlords of Draenor, Gorfine's stomach phase had ads that required constant control, and Arcane Torrent was one of the most efficient answers. In Mythic Plus dungeons throughout Legion, the racial became one of the most consistently impactful buttons across all content, giving every Blood Elf a group-wide silence with no setup. Blizzard eventually admitted to the design being unworkable for balance. A silence this flexible was too strong to sit on a racial, so Arcane Torrent was reworked into an AoE Purge instead. Looking back, Magtherion was just the start. The real story of Arcane Torrent is that it was just a raid breaker for over a decade, warping strategies, encounter race stacking, and erasing mechanics that were meant to define encounters. And that's not even mentioning the fact that the other part of the ability, which restored mana, was also one of the best healer racials for a few expansions, which needed to be nerfed into the ground as well. It was one of the clearest examples in WoW's history of a racial that was simply too powerful for its own good.